Wow.
Hi, my name is Amanda Campbell Crawford, and I'm the current chair for the Michigan Freedom Trail Commission. We want to welcome you to our 4th annual Heritage Gathering and ask that you celebrate with Railroad Month here in September. The Michigan Freedom Trail Commission was founded in 1998 with the intense mission and purpose to promote, preserve, interpret, understand, and educate on Michigan's unique role in the Underground Railroad. The Underground Railroad is one of history's greatest examples of the pursuit of civil rights, a conversation that even 174 years later, we ask that you ask questions, lean in, learn, and most of all, we hope that you share what you hear here today. If you have questions or comments or feedback for us, or you're interested in the Michigan Freedom Trail Commission, we hope that you reach out. Thanks for joining us.
Hello, I'm Sandra Clark, Director of the Michigan History Center. And on behalf of our parent agency, the Michigan Department of Natural Resources, I'm pleased to welcome you today to the 4th Annual Underground Railroad Heritage Gathering. One of the silver linings of the past few months has been seeing the ability of virtual programming to reach more people and bring in different speakers from across the country. This year, our Freedom Trail Commission Conference Committee, Dr. Roy Finkenbein, Dr. Angela Dillard, and Dr. Jason Young have put together an exceptional program for all of us to examine Michigan's 1847 support of freedom seekers and the 1850 Fugitive Slave Act. But our embracing of virtual programs that we have forgotten how valuable in-person sharing of knowledge and experiences is. So we hope that all of you who can will join us on October 2nd in Ann Arbor at the Clements Library to share even more about the work being done in Michigan today and to discover that wonderful library's collections. As always, special thanks to all of you who give your time and effort to tell Michigan's exceptional, inspiring stories of resistance to slavery.
Hello, I'm Paul Erickson, the director of the William L. Clements Library at the University of Michigan. On behalf of all of my colleagues here at the Clements, I want to say what an honor it is to help co-host the 4th Annual Heritage Gathering of the Michigan Freedom Trail Commission. We're looking forward to seeing all of you collect, preserve, and share the printed and written record of America's diverse histories up to 1900. Our collections of rare books, prints, maps, and manuscripts have particular strengths in the history of exploration, the American Revolution, and 19th century reform, including abolitionism and the work of the Underground Railroad. Situated right at the heart of campus, the Clements is the finest collection of early Americana at a public university in the United States. And that public university part makes a big difference. Our collections exist to be used in teaching and research by students and faculty at the university, scholars around the country, and also by the people of Michigan. If this year's Heritage Gathering is your first visit to the Clements, welcome. We hope you come back again to explore the library's collections. Thank you.
Hello and welcome to everyone who has checked in or will see this in its recorded format. I'm Roy Finkenbein. I'm a member of the commission and a professor of history at the University of Detroit Mercy. And it's my pleasure tonight to serve as moderator. I'd like to, since this is our last virtual session, say several thank yous. One is obviously to the commission as a whole and to the Michigan History Center for their role in this, and particularly to Sherry Giffen and to Toby Voigt for hosting and doing all the IT work to make sure this happens as it should. I'd also like to thank the Network to Freedom, the National Park Service, for providing funding to assist in arranging for and supporting our speakers. Before I introduce Richard Blackett, who is the Andrew Jackson Professor of History Emeritus at Vanderbilt University, I'd like to say that Richard and I have probably kind of time-wise paralleled each other in the profession. I think my first book review published in a scholarly journal was of Richard's beating against the barriers. And I said good things about it, but I also was brash enough as a young scholar to send him a copy in advance of publication and say, what do you think? And Richard, in his inimitable style, said what he thought. And I've continued to be educated by Richard, both his writings and his wit and his knowledge for decades. We won't say how many. Richard, should you need strength for the journey, and this goes back to a 1980s story, there's Red Stripe on hand. And once you're done, if you could get to Detroit, it's all yours. Otherwise, the next time you come, I'll make sure you're well treated.
Okay.
Richard has written many books dealing with Black abolitionism, slave narratives, freedom seekers. And over the last decade or so, he's been in a real journey to educate us about the politics of the Underground Railroad. And I'm most appreciative for the work he's done. Some of you may know his book, Making Freedom, The Underground Railroad and the Politics of Slavery. More recently, and more importantly, The Captive's Quest for Freedom, Fugitive Slaves, the 1850 Fugitive Slave Law, and the Politics of Slavery. Really looking forward to Richard's efforts tonight to connect these 1847 and other 1840s slave rescues to the politics of slavery, and in particularly the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850. As you listen to Richard and questions come to mind, don't hesitate to post in the chat section, and I'll be trying to pay attention to those and moderate those, and Richard will have, I'm sure, some answers at the end. Take it away, Richard.
Thank you, Roy. And thanks for the organizers, for involved with me in what has been, for me, an educational few weeks, listening to folks dealing with the 1847 rescues. Tonight, I'm going to try and put all of that in what I think is a significant historical context. In history, as in politics, we are always in search of a precipitous event whose consequences has even greater significance. That is the case of the 4 rescues in Michigan in 1847. They led, many in this webinar have argued, to the passage of the 1850 Fugitive Slave Law. While not dismissing or even questioning that connection, I would suggest, before we reach a definitive conclusion about the exact connection, that we broaden our view to include the many incidences that riled the country in the decade before the law's enactment, especially those that occurred in the latter half of the decade. Keep in mind that the search for a more effective law began before the ink had dried on the 1793 law. A motion in the House in 1796 called for changes. No action was taken. The issue was revisited in January and December 1801. Southerners condemned the employment of runaway slaves in the North. Northerners opposed the proposal and the bill failed. In 1817, a Senate committee reported a bill to revise the 1793 law, but it was not taken up. A House bill in the same year has some interesting features that anticipate the 1850 law. It addressed the growing insecurity of slave property in border states. Slaveholders could go to court under the terms of this proposed law in their state and prove their right to an escapee. With that stamp of legal approval, they could reclaim the runaway through a requisition on the governor of the state in which the formerly enslaved had taken refuge. Under this bill, habeas corpus would have no force. There would be no trial by jury. It would be a penal offense for a state officer to decline to enforce the law. The bill was passed 84 to 69. The Senate agreed with its aims, but limited it to 4 years and required proof of ownership. The House rejected the Senate's modification. As a result, the bill died. Another bill was offered in both the House and Senate in the wake of the Missouri Compromise of 1820, but was not passed. And lastly, because of the connection between the 1847 rescues in Kentucky, that state's General Assembly protested Canada's admission of runaways and called on the federal government to negotiate with Great Britain on an extradition treaty. Negotiations did not begin, however, until 1826. All this shows that the search for what James Mason would call in 1850 a law with teeth had periodically occupied the attention of federal authorities, and all because the enslaved had taken it upon themselves to leave. That the search failed has less to do with the political skills of slaveholding interests and more to do with the lack of a larger political consequential event, something I would return to in a minute. Many years ago, Wilbur Silber called runaways missionaries in the cause of freedom. They were the ones who first initiate and later worsened the crisis over slavery by their decision to put some distance between themselves and their masters. As one runaway told a reporter after he had made it to Canada, he intended to make his feet feel for Canada and make his former owner feel it in his pocket. It is a beautiful political statement. Although there are no hard figures, all the evidence suggests that the numbers rose throughout the decade of the 1840s. As Andrew Butler pointed out in his speech to the Senate in 1850, Kentucky estimated it lost 30,000 worth of property every year. He put the total loss from slaveholding states at 200,000 a year. Now, these figures were bandied about with a sort of recklessness that is really amazing for us who try to make sense of the value of the lost property. Masons thought the number was in the region of 100,000 a year. All the figures are speculative, an indication, I would suggest, that says something about the slaveholders' desperation to reclaim their property. They point to a larger picture, however. The levels of loss were substantial. By the end of the decade, it was reported that just as an example, of over 110 runaways had passed through Clitheroe, Chillicothe, Ohio, over a 6-month period. In early 1850, a slave catcher observed that both Virginia and Maryland had lost more slaves than any other period. A Maryland editor concurred. Not a day passes, he wrote, when one or more slaves did not take a chance to reach a free state. Looking for them, Mason told his colleagues, was like looking for fish in the sea. The imagery tells the story. For those of us who came of age in the 1960s, it's almost Maoist. Not surprisingly, Butler placed the responsibility for such depredations at the feet of what he calls persons who inveigle slaves to leave. For Butler and many of his ilk, the enslaved could not possibly have taken the initiative to leave without the promptings of dark outside forces. There was, though, an element of truth in Butler's observation. Going south to aid slaves to escape had been a feature of the organized Underground Railroad for some time. These emissaries blended into the regular flow of trade between the sectors. We know something of their activities by their failures. It is clear that Alanson Work, James Burr, and George Thompson were following a tradition when they left Marion College in Quincy, Illinois, and crossed into Missouri to aid the enslaved to escape. They were caught and imprisoned, but that stopped neither the flow of slaves out of Missouri nor the arrival of emissaries from Illinois. By the end of the decade, a Missourian declared that these subversives were, as she put it, thick as maggots on a dead horse. Free blacks, whites, and slaves facilitated escapes. Charles Torrey and Thomas Smallwood ran a successful operation in Washington, D.C., until Torrey was caught and imprisoned. When he died in prison in 1846, his place was taken by William Chaplin. Chaplin was one of the driving forces behind the dramatic escape of 77 from D.C. on the Pearl in April 1848. The daring escapes they knew and they estimated correctly would shock the country, and it did. Local authorities were nonplussed by the escape from Lexington, Kentucky in September 1844 of Lewis Hayden, his wife, and his son. Calvin Fairbank, a graduate of Oberlin, and Delia Webster of Maine, both teachers at a local school, were caught, tried, and sent to the state penitentiary for organizing the escape of the Hayden family. The Haydens moved to Boston, where they became fixtures in the local struggle against enforcement of the Fugitive Slave Law. When Fairbank was released after almost 10 years, he returned to his activities, this time in Louisville. Despite their best efforts, no border state managed to rid itself of the southern, what I call the southern arm of the Underground Railroad. They created defense organizations and sometimes staunched the bleeding, but the escapes invariably resumed after a pause. There were a number of dramatic escapes from slavery in the late 1840s, including those involving Michigan. Let's look at three. We have already mentioned the attempted escape on the Pearl in April 1848, which almost succeeded, were it not for unfavorable winds and a prompt response from the authorities. At the end of the year, a man and a woman, William and Ellen Craft, escaped from Macon, Georgia. She, for all intents and purposes, was white, he black. She disguised herself as a slaveholder traveling to Philadelphia for medical reasons. He accompanied her as her slave. They left over the Christmas holiday. Traveling by train, boat, and carriage, they made it to their destination in 4 days. Theirs was possibly the most dramatic escape from slavery, a story of love, determination, and resilience, the virtues of frontier America, countering all odds. The Crafts later moved to Boston. They were not satisfied with their successful escape. They took their story on the road as part of the abolitionist struggle to end slavery. They almost became fixtures in Black Boston's determination to protect those who made it to the city from slavery. Another famous escape, Henry Box Brown, joined them on the abolitionist lecture circuit, carrying with him his box in which he had escaped most dramatically from Richmond, Virginia to Philadelphia in the spring of 1849. By March of 1850, during the debate over the Fugitive Slave Law, it was clear to Daniel Webster that because of dramatic and routine escapes, that the South had what he called a well-founded ground of complaint. The activities of the enslaved and those who supported them had brought the country, Henry Clay told his colleagues, to what he called the edge of a political precipice. The distracted and unhappy country, as Clay put it, was in shock. It was time again to address the growing problem and enact a new fugitive slave law. The acquisition of a vast swath of territory from Mexico at the end of the war provided the political opening to do what earlier legislators, despite their best efforts, had failed to do. The Fugitive Slave Law, as we know, was one feature of the compromise which Clay brought to the Senate, aimed at addressing the political crises created by the new lands. This is the political context that made the fugitive law possible, something neither Butler, Underwood, nor any of their predecessors were able to accomplish. Mason's Law, as many call it, drew heavily on a report of a select committee of the Virginia Assembly, which in 1848-49 made a number of recommendations aimed at addressing that fugitive slave problem. The report was based on what, by mid-century, had become a generally accepted historical myth, namely that Southern states would not have consented to join the Union had the Constitutional Convention not addressed the issue of fugitive slaves. The 1793 law was meant to buttress a solemn compact between the states. That compact had been steadily undermined by the actions of the enslaved, political fanatics, and sectional jealousy. Not only were runaways harbored and protected, but vexatious suits, as someone put it, and prosecutions had been initiated against owners or their agents, resulted sometimes in imprisonment. These actions were buttressed by a series of laws passed by Northern legislators meant to defy both the 1793 law and evade their constitutional obligations. Mobs composed of fanatics as ruffians and fugitive slaves had sometimes made it impossible to retrieve captives. As a result, the cost of recapture often exceeded the value of the enslaved retrieved. Something had to be done if a border war was to be avoided. They recommended a federal policing system. Commissioners, clerks, marshals, postmasters, and collectors of customs would be given the authority to issue certificates to claimants. Marshals would have the power to make arrests and to call out a posse to ensure the return of the enslaved, all expenses to be covered by the public treasury of the United States. Finally, the committee, this is the Virginia Committee, recommended increasing the penalty for obstruction, renditions, making assemblies meant to obstruct the operation of the law a misdemeanor, and any death resulting from resistance a felony. There we have the rationale, I think, for the 1850 Fugitive Slave Law. The law voted on in the summer contained all the mechanisms of the 1817 House Bill, which aimed to address the growing insecurity of slave property, divvying up the land gained from Mexico, provided Congress with the political opportunity to address a growing political problem caused by the activity of the slaves and those who supported their bid for freedom, including the 4 Michigan cases. So it is my contention, in conclusion, that that larger political opening with the acquisition of territory at the end of the Mexican War provided the political background, the political space in which Southerners and their representatives and their Northern supporters could come up with a law that many had been hankering after for over 50 years. The cases from Michigan clearly were influential, but so were those other cases that I have mentioned, and many, many more that took place in that critical period between the mid-1840s and the end of the decade. With that, I would end and answer any questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Richard, for offering that big picture perspective. And I think it's given us a lot to think about. While I'm bouncing some questions off of Richard, I'd urge any of you that care to feed questions into the chat function at the bottom of your page. Richard, I think you provided convincing evidence of the economic grievance that the South had with the losses of slaves, particularly from the Upper South. I mean, we know along the Ohio River there were sometimes cities that were largely denuded of slaves by the 1850s because of the Wheeling and others that were, so many were taking flight. Freedom seekers were finding their way to Canada or the far north or somewhere else. But I have this lingering question, I guess, about how we balance in the push to the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850, how we balance the economic grievances with what I might call the political grievances. When we were young men, the book Southern Honor came out. And we all know this propensity of Southern slaveholders and their political allies to act on questions of honor and reputation. And one of the things that strikes me is that these Northern rescues, whether in Michigan or elsewhere, were also striking at the honor of Southern slaveholders and their political allies. And I wonder where we come down in terms of the balance between the economic and political grievances as motivating factors for the Fugitive Slave Act.
Oh, that's a big question, Roy. But I think the two we have to mesh the two. I don't think they're separable. The economic pain and the consequences of losing those runaways has to be seen also in the context of the regularity with which people left. And it is that regularity that created problems. So when slaves say leave from say Southwest Missouri, the effect is immediately felt in Jefferson City, the capital of the state. And that ripples outwards, I would argue, to Washington, D.C., because what the states are incapable of resolving, they turn naturally towards the national level in order to find a solution to address this problem. And that is so I think there's a political crisis around these enslaved people who keep running away. And that political crisis also has economic consequences. And it is always easier to articulate your grievance in economic terms by arguing that there are people who are depriving us of our rights, our economic rights, and those economic rights are substantial. And the numbers, therefore, are easier to latch on to than some vague political whimpering that people undertake at times like this. So I think those two things go together. And when the slaveholder decides, or his agent or her agent decides to go after a runaway, that creates another political crisis when they connect. As soon as they connect, there's another political crisis. So it's a whole series of political crises, I would suggest. And those political crises are most easily articulated in economic terms. We know, for instance, James Mason has this wonderful, he makes it in one of his speeches as the 1850 law is coming to an end, that his neighbors in Virginia have just gone off to Harrisburg, Pennsylvania to recapture 4 of their slaves, 4 runaways. They do succeed, but Mason is clear to tell his colleagues, look, the price of that success is minimal because it costs the slaveholder to hire an agent, to hire police to go there, and all those other expenses. It isn't worth it. He almost throws his arms up. But he says, to get back to your point of honor, he says it has to be done nonetheless. So it's a quandary. It's a quandary that they find themselves in,
right?
Because they are, if it's economically disadvantageous to go trundling off to Pennsylvania in search of your slaves, just why do it? You can add up the cost, and if the cost comes out that you end up in the red, why do it?
We have several questions from participants in the audience, and some really good questions. I wanted to ask one more. I'll exercise my right as moderator.
Yes, prerogative.
You talked briefly about how the Mexican War changed things politically and in the context of the feasibility of a Fugitive Slave Act. One of the things that struck me is another book that came out just a little bit after yours, Robert Churchill's book on the geography of violence, and he provides that compendium at the end. And while we could find a few cases missing here or there, one of the things he demonstrates is that there's this tremendous flowering of rescues across the North, not just Michigan. Michigan has the most, but across the North in 1847. In fact, the raw numbers go from 2 that he identified to 14, and we added a 15th with the John Felix White case. And I'm wondering, in a political sense, just how important is the Mexican War in heightening the political angst, sensibilities, and anger on both sides that kind of help make 1850 possible and necessary?
Well, I think the war has a different role to play. It provides a political opening in which slaveholding interests can address something that they have always wanted to address. And the background, what happens, I mean, Henry Clay's phrases about being on the precipice politically and all those other kinds of very emotive phrases tells us something that folks have been hankering. Slaveholding interests and their supporters had been hankering after this, as I pointed out at the beginning, since 1793, before the ink had dried on the 1793 law. And there was no political opening in which this law could be passed. And that is where I think the Mexican War, I am suggesting in this piece, that the Mexican War provides that political space in which you could address a whole host of problems, besides what you do with California and what you do with the territory in Texas. And you can now, so that Clay can plunk into this compromise, this thing that has absolutely nothing to do with the Mexican War. It really doesn't. I mean, if you look at all the other issues, there is some direct relevance to what to do with this new territory. The Fugitive Slave Law does not. So I would suggest that it provides a political space in which a skilled politician, as Clay is, undoubtedly is, can introduce something that is patently extraneous to addressing the question of what to do with the result of the Mexican-American War, and to get it passed, not easily, but in the long run to get it passed. And I think that is the political space that the war provides, or the consequences of the war provides for the enactment of this law, that otherwise I would suggest would not have happened.
Thank you for sharing that. Linda Haas, who is a friend of the Freedom Trail Commission and a well-published local Underground Railroad historian in Jackson, Michigan, asks how you became interested in the particular topic of the politics of the Underground Railroad. Were there particular things that initially sparked your interest?
I had written a number of books, as you know, Roy, about the role of African Americans in the antebellum period, in the larger international movement, in the Civil War. And folks kept asking me, but what about the enslaved? And it dawned on me that we needed to look at what the enslaved were doing and what the consequence of their actions were. Because as a youngster in this business, I remember reading a piece by a fellow countryman of mine, a man with much greater vision than I could ever have, C.L.R. James. And he said, the purpose of the abolitionist movement is to aid runaway slaves. And that stuck with me. He said they had no other. I mean, what they had to do was, and in doing that, they upset the political equilibrium. I said, okay, I mean, C.L.R. James had this knack of making bold statements that he never supported. But this one struck me as something that had some merit. So what do the actions of the enslaved, what by their actions can we, from their actions, can we learn about their notions of freedom? Yeah, they've left us not everybody is Frederick Douglass, they've left us no records, but they kept running away. And they had some vision of what it meant to put some distance between themselves and their masters. So that's how I got interested in this. Plus the fact that I was bored with what I was doing and I needed to do something else.
And you couldn't find any red stripe handies.
No. And now I'm writing a book about football.
Okay, good.
Soccer, that is.
Right.
So somebody's going to ask me, how did you get interested in this? And I am going to have no idea.
As kind of a particular follow-up to what you just talked about, Sharon Sexton, who's a Detroiter who's done a lot of work kind of getting recognition for local Underground Railroad sites and history, asks about the Robert Cromwell rescue that I talked about a couple of weeks ago.
Yeah.
And her question is, how pivotal was something like this in passing the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850? I think you're suggesting that it was the kind of collectivity.
Yes,
but were there particular ones that stand out, like maybe the Cromwell rescue, that generated greater national and regional concern, discussion, etc.?
It's hard to say. I mean, I take Marty's, I read her piece that she did in which she looks at 19th century commentators and relatively modern historians to try and put connections between what happened in 1847 in Michigan and the passage of the Fugitive Slave Law. And it's wonderful local and national analysis that I think has some merit, has considerable merit, I would add. But the point is, I think these things, by their very nature, have a cumulative effect that is in search of a resolution. And you have to ask yourself the question, how does a resolution come about? And look, when Box Brown had himself created in a box, it created an incredible national furor. And what is amazing is, and we haven't done enough work on this, is how many other attempts were made to escape in boxes in the 1850s. I mean, Box Brown just set an example. And if you remember Frederick Douglass sending that warning to his colleagues, we shouldn't make a public outcry about this because it tells the slaveholders what is going on and they'll be on the alert to stop it in the future. But the point is, there were so many other attempts by fugitives to escape using a box that you have to give old Box Brown a huge amount of credit for his ingenuity and the people in Richmond who assisted him. But Box Brown escape really had national. We know that from just looking at the coverage of it. So does the Pearl escape. I mean, it created riots in Washington, D.C. Yet neither of those incidences we can say led directly to the 1850 Fugitive Slave Law. But my argument, my contention is that collectively all these things, all the craziness that's going on in Michigan and in Washington, D.C. and out of Richmond, collectively, they have an impact. But I wouldn't like to separate. I wouldn't like to rank them in importance. I don't think it's an exercise that gets us very far.
It's kind of collectively they're creating a milieu that is changing.
Yeah.
In the context of discussing the politics of slavery. Carol Mall, who is known statewide for her excellent book on the Underground Road in Michigan, asks that you talk a little bit about abolitionism in the southern states and its potential threat to enslavers. In other words, did they sense at any point that there were foxes in the henhouse, as it were?
Yeah. Listen, these local historians who have come up with amazing research, like that have been lobbing these questions at me, I cannot compete. They are the ones. They are the foot soldiers who have been digging and delving for years and doing a lot of good work. But I am not certain about abolitionists in the South as we have come to know abolitionists after, say, the founding of the American Anti-Slavery Society. But what I do know is that there were free blacks and whites and enslaved people who aided folks to escape. And those enslaved people stayed behind. So if you read, particularly in the 1850s, which I am much more familiar with, if you read local coverage, you would see there's a lot of hand wringing and a lot of pulling out of hair by local authorities trying to disentangle the connection between a particular escape and the local people who may have aided. If you look at the Kentucky State Penitentiary records, you would see how many people, blacks, free blacks and whites, who are spending a lot of time in that Kentucky State Prison because they aided slaves to escape. So that is the nature of the abolitionist movement that I find most intriguing, because it gets us to the point of understanding what informal organizations existed, how local people got together to effect an escape, and what that sometimes we can't always identify the individuals, but we do know from reports that these, at least it was on the minds of the local authorities. So as you see, as some of the papers in the webinar have pointed out, they created, Southern slaveholding interests created organizations to protect their interests. And that is always a giveaway. There's no need to have county-wide organizations with local police forces involved, paying people to aid, to stop the flow of people, of runaways. And that tells me that the runaways is having an effect on people's pockets, but it is also having a deep political effect in those states from which people are fleeing.
We've got 3 more questions, one of which I'm going to broaden out. Richard, you and I are part of the erstwhile board of advisors for something called the Slave Stampedes Project that Deonda Johnson, the Midwest Regional Coordinator for the Network to Freedom, and the folks like Matthew Pinsker, Dickinson College, are working on. And one question is asking you about the potential effect of things like there's 28 enslaved people that escaped through Ohio and Michigan to Canada. I think it's 1853. It's one of these slave stampedes. And I broadened it out to ask your perspective on what role, since they started, the word slave stampede started in 1840, started to be used about that point to refer slave stampedes as opposed to just the word stampede. And you start to see an expansion of slaves running away in groups. And I wonder if you have any thoughts on how those kind of events on the landscape heated up the political landscape vis-a-vis slavery.
Yeah, well, there are two parts to that question that intrigues me. One is, what does it tell us about the organization of the folks who left? That 28 people could get together and decide to leave as a group. I mean, there's all kind of potential vulnerabilities involved with that, but more importantly, it tells us something. It is not clear what, but it tells us something about local organizations among the people who are planning to leave. Yeah? There's one instance of a group that fled Kentucky into Ohio in about, I can't remember the exact period in the year in the 1850s, but the local report said the head of the group, and they identified the person as the head of this group of people who were running away, read extracts from Uncle Tom's Cabin before they left. Now, hello, what does that could drive you crazy trying to work out what that means. I mean, because as you know, as we all know, Uncle Tom's Cabin is banned. in this. How did people get hold of a copy of Uncle Tom's Cabin? And the fact that the person can read extracts from it doesn't say what extracts they read, but he could read extract. It means that he could read. It means he had the ability to acquire a copy of the book, and he got the people together to try and inspire them that they should do what they do, either because Little Eva did it and guys, we could do it. But it does tell you something about the organization and the potential of people to organize to resist this kind of oppression. And that intrigues me. I think that is the best way of getting at it. And those stampedes also meant, there's also examples of people who started off from different parts, say, of Kentucky, and they happened to run into one another on the way out of Kentucky, and they get together, they amalgamate themselves, and they do a collective effort to get away. So they're all kind of ways. Some is serendipitous because they didn't plan this out, but it happened as they were in the process of escaping. And in other times it is planned, but these large numbers cause a lot of pain. And it is usually after a big escape, a stampede, or a collective of a number of frequent small escapes over a short period of time that usually results in the organization among slaveholders of defense systems to protect themselves and to stop it happening. So stampedes take two forms. A big group leaves, or alternatively, I think that small groups and individuals leaving at a regular intervals over a short period of time give the impression that a large group of people are leaving. And the only way we can get at that is by borrowing ourselves in local newspapers in the South.
Which is a wise word for all historians, but particularly people that work in things like you and I do with the Underground Railroad. Local sources, and particularly newspapers, 19th century newspapers, become crucial. Someone named Jennifer Wood actually asked a question that kind of follows in this thread. She wants you to share your thoughts on questions that we still need to answer about this topic, the politics of the Underground Railroad, and what are some important future directions for scholarship?
I think we now have to flip our gaze a little. We have to start looking at how those people who ran away, where they settled in northern states particularly. I'm not so concerned about the Canadians because they leave the picture by and large. But those who settled in places like Boston or Battle Creek or wherever it is, Cass County, the extent to which they brought, by their storytelling and by their actions, they brought slavery to the attention of local people. And how that attention and how that message influenced individuals to become involved in the movement. Not only locally, but also in the broader abolitionist movement. I mean, you just take, for instance, when Samuel, well, let's take Garnett, Henry Highland Garnett, or Frederick Douglass, although I am loath to bring up Frederick Douglass because everybody brings up Frederick Douglass. But when either of those men got up and said their piece about their experiences in slavery, they didn't have to take off their shirt and bare their back, but by just telling their story to people, it could not have, given their power, given their skills as orators, it could not but have influenced people to take another look at this institution. They may not have acted on it, but I think that's an area that we have to start looking at very seriously, particularly as it influenced the emergence of anti-slavery political parties. I'm thinking of Liberty Party, Free Soil, and less so, but also the Republican Party. I think that's
remember in the I'm sorry, I remember in the introduction to one of the volumes of the Black Abolitionist Papers, a phrase where they talked about the eloquence of people like Douglas or Garnett. But then we inserted the line based on documents we had seen from newspaper clippings that sometimes the halting story of an unlettered fugitive could also move audiences to tears.
Yes.
And so I think you're right. The presence of these people in communities had an impact.
Yes, and listen, let me just add, the abolitionists knew how to exploit that. There's a wonderful story when I was doing my book on Black Americans in the Anglo-American anti-slavery movement. That when William and Ellen Crafts were in England, they hooked up with William Wells Brown, another fugitive, right? And they toured Britain, taking their message. William Wells Brown would give a general lecture about the nature of slavery and the struggle against it. William Craft would get up, would follow him, and talk about their particular escape, their dramatic escape from Georgia. And Ellen, who, as I mentioned, looks white, is phenotypically white, sat in the back of the audience. And at that point, they asked her, please walk up to the stage. And she would slowly walk down the aisle. And you read local reports of the impact of that people said, but it's a white woman. I mean, she didn't call herself that, but visibly, she is a white woman. That has an incredible impact on audiences, more so in England than in America, who are becoming increasingly aware of that there were slaves who looked like their owners. But it raised all kinds of questions, and audiences couldn't help but be moved by that kind of, yeah?
It developed empathy, which could lead to action, including helping runaways. I thought as you were talking, we had our own example in America. Think of Henry Ward Beecher, who had that practice in the 1850s of, in what was essentially an anti-slavery church, Plymouth Church, of having mock slave auctions of real formerly enslaved women who were very light-skinned, like Pinky and others, because it would have an impact on a white audience.
Yeah,
and he was very cognizant of that.
Some skeptics who work in this field call that kind of pornography, but I think it has an amazing impact. It has an amazing impact.
Sure. Feel free to do as I would do with these next couple. I know who they are because I'm living and working in Michigan. You may well know them or not know them, but a couple of people have asked for your thoughts about two conductors or Underground Railroad activists that are well known in Michigan, Amos Array and Charles Osborne. Amos Array in Ypsilanti and Charles Osborne in Cass County. Do you know of them or any thoughts about them? Or
I have heard of Osborne, but I don't know very much about him. The other person I know absolutely. This is why local history matters, and people should keep doing it so that it could educate people like me about these things. But I thought I was going to get a question about Lambert, or the two characters that you talked about in your talk.
Well, let me ask you then. I've made the argument that in some ways the Colored Vigilant Committee, and we all know that, you know, late 1830s, early 1840s, larger communities across the Northeast, from, you know, Detroit to Boston, are forming these vigilance committees, as I've called them, the urban arm of the Underground Railroad. My sense is Detroit is the place that remains the most fervently in black hands, even though they work with some friendly whites. And it's because of these two fellows, William Lambert and George de Baptiste, and some others, William Monroe and George Reynolds and others at various points. And I'm wondering your thoughts about the Colored Vigilant Committee, these two leaders, and kind of where we should position them and this group within the history of the Underground Railroad.
Well, look, de Baptiste cut his teeth in a border community, right? I mean, and it was rumored that they had to leave in a hurry. It isn't quite clear if that is absolutely the case. But there was another character who was in that organization in Madison, a very light-skinned guy who then went off down the river or up the river and operated between there and Cleveland. And so they continued, although they were dispersed after the middle 1840s, I think. I think de Baptiste comes to Detroit in
46.
46, right? Mm-hmm. So that organization that was very effective in Madison across the river, it is there that he cut his teeth, so that by the time he got to Detroit, he knew how this thing worked. And the point is, Detroit is geographically pivotal to all of this. So it makes it more significant, I think, in many ways than some of the other organizations that were created in places like New York City and other places, or Philadelphia, because they are moving people. They're not only protecting, but they have this ability to move people away from danger very quickly, as you pointed out in your talk and in instances. So,
you know, one of the things that struck me when I did the research for the book chapter on the Colored Vigilant Committee of Detroit, yeah, you have these people who pick up their knowledge and skills in MO, in Underground Road work at other places, and then come to Detroit. The Baptiste is a great example of that. Another who's important but overlooked, he's really as important as those two other figures for a short period from 1847 into the early 1850s, is a man named George Reynolds, who had worked with Levi Coffin in Indiana, you know, north of Richmond, Newport, Indiana, and he learned in that operation, and then he brought his skills to Detroit. And it makes me think of one of the things that may be something we need to do more work with yet, is how personnel in these groups, these networks, learn in one place and then take their skills to another. That's kind of the argument of Keith Griffler in that little book, Front Line of Freedom, where he sees people fanning up and down the Ohio River, including Madison. And I'm wondering if there's a lot more story there yet to tell if somebody systematically looked at these Underground Railroad activists, not just along the river, but throughout the Ohio River Valley in the Midwest and the Northeast.
Yeah, I use an imagery. They're like spores. The wind blows them in different places, and they take root in a new place and use their experiences from all the earlier activities. And I don't want to get subversive and suggest that they were deliberately sent by some unseen hand, but these guys continued their activities where they went.
And, you know, one of the things that we know from the early abolitionist work of Jim McPherson before he became a Civil War historian and all these other things, is the extent to which we sometimes draw a hard and fast line on their activism at the Civil War, and that many of these people continued their activism in a variety of racial arenas until their deaths. As Frederick Douglass said in 1865 at the American Anti-Slavery Society annual meeting, when Garrison, William Lloyd Garrison and others, whites, wanted to wrap the show, he says, "Our work's half done." And so people were taking some of these leadership and organizational skills and continuing them into
But what's
other
interesting
movements.
is how many of them went south after the war. Douglas didn't, but how many of them went and into some very strange places in the South. Do you want to, I mean, Pennington going to Florida. Why? I have no idea. But they saw the need to continue the struggle in these very trying times.
These became training grounds, just like I've argued Canada. Those Canadian communities and leaders there who go south after the Civil War, in many cases, Canada serves as a training ground, but so does Underground Railroad activism. And I think Jennifer Wood, Richard's laid out a variety of paths. Choose one. Are there any other questions? I don't see any at the moment. I'd just ask one more before we wrap up, Richard.
Okay.
Let's talk football.
Uh-oh. Which kind of football? Soccer?
International football.
Oh, okay. Okay.
You have the book, I believe, in press, did you say? Or
No. I've written 3 chapters about it. No, it's a history of football in Trinidad and Tobago.
Okay.
It's a history. It's a book that tries to look at the sport in its social and economic and political setting.
That should be interesting.
So
I conflated with your mention of the Ward book being further along, right? Yes. Yeah. And if you don't know, and again, this is aimed at Jennifer Wood and other people that ask some of those wonderful questions. If you don't know about people like Samuel Ringgold Ward, and you mentioned other names, Pennington and Garnett, we focus on Douglas to the exclusion almost of these other folks. And while I love David Blight to death, we may be getting into the end of our Douglas rope, and there's certainly need for exploring a Ward and folks of their ilk who were almost as important as Douglas in their own time. Would you agree to that?
Yes. I think Ward doesn't get his due because he went into exile. And America is not kind to people who go into exile. They cut them off from American history. They welcome people who come into America, but Americans who leave usually are simply severed. So Ward becomes an exile. He dies in Jamaica. Right. And therefore he's almost lost to our history.
You're bringing him back.
Yes, hopefully.
Well, any closing thoughts, Richard?
No, this has been a wonderful opportunity to listen to folks who are delving deep into local history and trying to forge connections with larger national issues. And I think that is absolutely critical. And the local people, I could sit and listen to them for hours because they're the ones who are doing the legwork and finding things.
I agree. And we've got some really dedicated and thoughtful, energetic community historians who are doing this work in Michigan, and people like Linda Haas and Carol Mull and others that I mentioned. I'd just say a few things in closing. One is a thank you to Richard for a really engaging presentation and discussion. A thank you to all of the folks that are involved in this virtual series, which we're going to take into other forms, I think, in the months ahead. Bridget Stryker, who you saw briefly on evening one, who is with the Boone County, Kentucky Library, working with Deonda Johnson of the Network to Freedom, has put together a wonderful story map of the 1847 rescues in Michigan. And we will be making that available in the days ahead. Look for information both posted on the Michigan Freedom Trail Commission site, as well as possibly emailed to you, publicized in other ways, perhaps.
I'd like to see that.
It's good, and we could get you an advanced copy. Okay, still in progress, but advanced copy. On Saturday, there is going to be a live gathering with mask at Ann Arbor, the William Clements Library. If you don't know about this, look at the Michigan Freedom Trail Commission site, and there's information about the program. It'll be a combination of looking at sources, particularly in the morning, including the Clements Library, and in the afternoon, some presentations by historians about everything ranging from free blacks and fugitive slaves who settled in parts of Michigan to community institutions today that emerged from the Underground Railroad to the Native Americans' role in the Underground Railroad in Michigan. So look for that, and we'd love to have you join us. And continue to look for information from the Michigan Freedom Trail Commission, including Vimeo recordings of these for the series of 4 talks. So we hope you had a good month. Remember each year to celebrate International Underground Railroad Month in September. And we are glad you joined us along this journey. Thank you very much, Richard. Thank you, everyone, and take care and have a good evening.
Thank you, Roy.